On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War had begun. The Polish army crumbled under the German onslaught, and then on September 17th, the Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east. But what about this campaign? See, a lot has been said, written and YouTube about the German campaign in Poland. But what about the Soviet offensive? Did the Polish army put up any resistance? What battles occurred? What losses were suffered? In this video, we're gonna take a deep dive into one of the most overlooked military campaigns of the Second World War, the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland. Keep watching. When reading in English literature about the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland 1939, it is often briefly mentioned. It was overshadowed by the much larger German invasion that claimed way more casualties and also kicked off the Second World War. But still, the Soviets did suffer several thousands of casualties during their invasion, so it can hardly be called a walk in the park. You know what is also not a walk in the park? Being a history YouTuber, as well as protecting your data. That's why I'm thrilled to announce today's sponsor, Private Internet Access VPN. Ever wondered how to stay secure online while surfing the web? PIA VPN has the answer. It encrypts your internet connection, making your data unreadable to hackers and trackers. PIA VPN never records or stores user data, and its no logs policy has been proven multiple times in court. With over 90 countries to choose from, connecting to a fast, reliable server is just a tap away. It's as simple as this. Choose your server, tap connect, and boom, you're anonymous online. And here is more. One subscription protects an unlimited number of devices at the same time, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee plus 24/7 customer support, you can enjoy your privacy online everywhere, anytime. Personally, I use VPN to read and search for historical articles that are not always available without changing the geographical location, and PIA VPN helps me a lot in this. And right now there's a special deal. By using my link piavpn.com/historyhustle, you can get 83% off, bring it down to just $2.03 per month, and you'll score 4 extra months free. So why wait? Secure your online freedom today. So to understand why the Red Army invaded Eastern Poland in 1939, we must take a look at the agreements that were made between Germany and the USSR prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. It was Germany that approached the USSR in May 1939. Hitler had plans for a quick campaign against Poland, but was not sure if he could get away with it this time, meaning the Allies, Britain and France, not intervening. In July, political negotiations about the affairs of Eastern Europe followed. Early August, Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop offered a settlement for the area from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and the Soviets, they were interested. See, many of these regions had previously belonged to the Tsarist Empire, but were lost after the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War. And do notice that what was back then Eastern Poland was not only inhabited by ethnic Poles. In Eastern Poland, the population was about 43% Polish, 33% Ukrainian, and 8% each Jewish and Belarusian, with a small number of Czechs, Germans, Russians, Roma, Tatars, and others. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact, was signed on the 23rd of August 1939. It was seen as a strange act in history, where two seemingly opposing ideologies made a pact. And however the Nazis and the Communists, they despised one another, in reality they had much in common. See, both the USSR and Germany under Hitler were totalitarian states, in which dissidents were violently oppressed. But that was not the main reason why the pact was signed. It was a typical case of pragmatism trumping ideology. On August 23rd, Nazi Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop landed with his plane in Moscow. He was escorted to the Kremlin and negotiations followed. Now, the part of non-aggression was quickly agreed upon, But how to divide Eastern Europe in spheres of influence took a bit longer. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the documents were ready. Molotov signed for the Soviet Union, Ribbentrop for Germany. 2 hours later, Hitler was notified at Berchtesgaden. Champagne was ordered, and Hitler, a non-drinker, sipped a little. German delight was impossible to conceal. "Now Europe is mine," Hitler is said to have cried out on hearing the news. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Polish-German War of 1939 had begun. By a swift and ruthless advance of the German planes in the air and armored units on the ground, they smashed through the Polish defenses. The Allies, France and Britain, they demanded Germany to withdraw from Poland immediately. And when no reply followed, they acknowledged that they were now at war with Germany. In the meanwhile, the Poles fought valiantly, but they could not stop the German war machine. On that day, September 3rd, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov told the German ambassador in Moscow the following: "We are of the view that the time to start concrete action has not yet come. It seems to us that through excessive haste we might injure our cause and promote unity among our opponents." It seemed that the Soviets adopted a wait-and-see attitude. But do notice that the day before, on September 2nd, a state of alert was declared in the border area with Poland, and the Soviet troops over there were brought up to battle readiness. On the 6th of September, partial mobilization of the Red Army was ordered. It was called a large-scale training drill. Then 6 days later, civilian traffic was reduced and the railway network in the west of the USSR came fully under control of the Red Army. The Kremlin was alarmed by the speed of the German attack and issued a political justification for their attack, in which was stated the following: "The Soviet government intended to take the occasion of further advance of German troops to declare that Poland was falling apart and that it was necessary for the Soviet Union in consequence to come to the aid of the Ukrainians and the White Russians." And it is true that minorities in the Second Polish Republic, for example Ukrainians, were oppressed by the Polish government. But this did not even come close to the Soviet oppressions of Poles in the USSR. For example, during the anti-Polish NKVD operations in 1937-38, in which over 100,000 Soviet Poles lost their lives. And however these territories once belonged to Tsarist Russia, the Soviet government had agreed to cede them to Poland during the Treaty of Riga that was signed in 1921, which concluded the Polish-Soviet War. On the 16th of September 1939, the Soviets ended their dispute with Japan. Ever since 1932, there had been ongoing border clashes between the Soviets and Japan, and that now ended. The Soviets were about to move in, but they wanted the government center of Poland to have fallen. Von Ribbentrop assured Molotov that this fall of Warsaw was only a few days away, as the Germans had laid siege on the Polish capital. And thus, on the 17th of September 1939, the Red Army crossed the border into Poland. Polish ambassador in Moscow, Wacław Grybowski, was summoned to the Kremlin. He was given a note in which it was stated that Poland had ceased to exist, and thus all previous agreements between the USSR and Poland were nullified. Also the 1932 Polish-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Grybowski, he protested and said that the Polish government was still in the country and the Polish army was still fighting. Did anyone question Russia's existence, he asked, when Napoleon occupied Moscow? Grybowski refused to accept the note and was escorted. So the Red Army forces that moved off that morning had been organized into two fronts, arranged to the north and south of the Pripyat River. The Belarusian front under General Mikhail Kovalev and the Ukrainian front under General Timon Timoshenko. A front was a Soviet military formation, roughly the equivalent of an army group. Together, they comprised nearly 500,000 combat troops divided into 28 rifle divisions, several cavalry divisions, 7 artillery regiments, and 10 armored brigades, and assisted by 4,850 tanks, 5,500 armored vehicles, and 2,000 aircraft. Each front also boasted 3 mobile spearheads made up of cavalry and tank brigades, which were to lead a swift advance into Poland and were given ambitious targets. They were to capture Vilnius, Grodno, and Lwów within 48 hours. And the three main battles that were fought during the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland took also place either within or near those cities. Speed was important, and Soviet Commissar for Defense Kliment Voroshilov named the Soviet advance a lightning strike. The task of the Soviet forces was to destroy and capture the armed forces of Poland, with the forward units moving both to cut off the Vilnius district in the north and to interrupt a general Polish retreat towards the southeast, the so-called Romanian bridgehead. See, many Polish forces that saw the writing on the wall, they decided to evacuate to Romania. So far the theory. Let's take a look at what happened on the ground, because that, as always, as reality is, was way more chaotic. But let's first discuss the opposing forces. During Stalin's purges of the 1930s, a huge proportion of the Red Army Officer Corps had been liquidated. The Red Army was not ready for battle. Its preparation was rushed, and thus the Soviet advance was characterized by logistical chaos and disorganization. Both fronts lacked personnel and military equipment. In some cases, soldiers had to go barefoot or had to advance into civilian clothing. An eyewitness described them as an army of beggars, an emaciated, ravenous crowd. Military hardware was, though numerous, was made up predominantly of two types: the BT-7, a lightly armored cruiser tank intended for swift advances, and the T-26, an older, slower infantry tank. Most Soviet tanks that were lost during this time were lost due to mechanical breakdown rather than to combat. Now, this would have been different if the Polish army was equipped with adequate anti-tank weapons, which they now lacked. The Poles were not impressed by the Soviet Air Force. These were biplanes of an outdated design. Accidents were common. One day before the Soviet invasion, Air Ace Sergei Litseyev, who had seen action in the Spanish Civil War and at Khalkhin Gol against Japan, died when his plane collided with another. When the Red Army advanced into Poland along the 1,400-kilometer frontier, they faced disparate Polish forces. Most belonged to the Polish Border Defense Corps, or the KOP. The KOP was formed in 1924 and had to control the Polish-Soviet frontier and prevent communist infiltration. They numbered around 12,000 men and were likely armed with little artillery or armor. There were also 300,000 regular army troops stationed in the east. Their state of readiness varied. Some were still in training, others had faced the Germans and had withdrawn eastward. They lacked air support and had not enough artillery. They did have some advantages. There was a static network of defenses north of the city of Rivne. The so-called Sarny fortified area had many bunkers and trenches, and it were the KOP units that were the first to fight against the invading Red Army. The confusion in the first hours was seen by an exchange between KOP commander Marceli Kotarba and the Polish High Command. See, Polish General Staff ordered him to send an envoy to the Soviets to find out what the Red Army was exactly up to which Kotarba replied, "All my battalions are fighting and 2 Soviet tanks have been destroyed. I doubt whether I will be able to fulfill the order regarding the envoy." For everything the KOP soldiers lacked, they were not lacking determination. In the northeastern corner of Poland, close to Latvia, KOP soldiers teamed up with local police and volunteers, among which students, to defend their district. One KOP battalion lost 50% of its men. In another encounter near Husiatin, a KOP regiment claimed over 200 Soviet dead. During the defense at the fortifications at Zarny, the border guards held off the numerically superior Soviet 60th Rifle Division. Here, Lieutenant Jan Bobot held off the Soviets for more than 2 days. He repeatedly asked for reinforcements that were not coming. When on the morning of the 21st of September his position was overrun, he and his surviving comrades were burned alive by Soviet flammable material. It is said that hundreds of Red Army troops fell before he did. But many KOP units followed orders not to engage the Soviets. Marshal Edward Śmigły-Rich had on the 17th of September ordered the Polish army not to fight the Soviets except in case of their attack or attempts to disarm our units, with Polish units to head for Romania and Hungary by the shortest routes, and to negotiate with Soviet forces over passage. This order seems to have reached at least some Polish army units. Many Polish units retreated westward in order not to be surrounded by the Red Army, one Polish officer recalled. I wonder about the sense of taking up arms in a doomed fight when we had no anti-tank weapons. Should we provide the tanks with cannon fodder just to make a statement? Wouldn't that be madness? Should we not instead avoid unnecessary losses? Behind the frontier, many Polish civilians were confused by what was going on. Many fled with the Polish forces to the west, and panic set in, as one eyewitness noted. Tonight the news was confirmed, the war declared by the Soviets. In a way, it dispels all doubt. All that is left for us is to die an honorable death. 20 days ago we had to get used to the thought of war. Now we must get used to the thought of total annihilation. Now in other areas, local people believed that the Soviets were coming in peace. One remembered Red Army troops being very friendly to the local population. They said they were coming in peace, and they said they were coming to liberate them. But liberate them of who exactly? The German army? Or the Polish government? Because some actually believed that the Red Army was coming in to take on the Germans. In Tarnopol, the local authorities urged the people to welcome the Soviets. It wasn't clear for many what the Soviets were coming to do here. And to be frank, a lot of Red Army soldiers did not know either. The Soviet commander made use of the confusion and drove around trucks with loudhailers. Future resistance fighter Jan Karski witnessed one voice in Polish in a thick Russian accent, shouting, "Hey you, are you with us or are you not? We aren't going to stand here in the middle of the road the whole day waiting for you to make up your minds. There's nothing to be frightened about. We are Slavs like yourselves, not Germans. We are not your enemies." Leaflets with a similar message were spread. In Vilnius, the local Polish commander, Colonel Jaroslaw Okulicz-Korzarin, had 7,000 soldiers at his disposal, ranging from volunteers to trained cutters, with a dozen of artillery pieces and machine guns. On the Hill of the Three Crosses and in the heart of the city, student volunteers were stationed. One warrant officer spoke about his first encounter with the Red Army. "We had our guns set on the road and we walked straight into the Russians like a dumb ox. Thankfully they didn't see us. We went through a yard, aimed our guns at the Russians and fired. The Soviets withdrew and they later reappeared, this time with tanks. And the men opened fire again. One Polish soldier, he was from Lwów, he took up hand grenades, he went to the tank up close and threw them on the tank. The tank exploded and the others withdrew. An eyewitness in another unit in Vilnius recalled the following. The Soviet tanks were followed by infantry. They cried, "Hurrah! For Stalin! For the motherland! Hurrah!" I will never forget those cries, but we took them with flanking fire. One falls, another comes after him, is hit, and another comes. A whole heap of corpses grew, and not a small one. We fought until evening, and I saw the tanks catch fire one after another, our chap throwing bottles with petrol. According to Red Army documents, the Red Army only suffered 24 casualties at Vilnius, but most likely the number is way higher. But due to their sheer numbers, the Red Army was able to eventually overwhelm the Polish forces that were forced to withdraw from Vilnius. A bigger battle was fought 120 kilometers to the southwest at the city of Grodno. Here the defense was well organized by scouts, firemen and civilian volunteers, including school children, students and refugees and soldiers from beyond the region who had fled the Germans, which were good for a fighting force of 2,000 men, and they had a strong will to fight. When the commanding officer announced to his troops that the Soviets were on their way, he offered them a chance to put down their arms. But, he said, those who are willing to fight should step to the right. And everyone did. Supplies of arms were short. 24 heavy machine guns, 2 anti-aircraft guns, and only rifles, sabers and lances. On the 20th of September, the Soviets launched their first assault on the city. A dozen of Red Army tanks drove straight for the city of Grodno and ran into organized resistance. The defenders threw homemade petrol bombs from upper floors to the tanks that caught fire, and these tanks stood no chance in the narrow streets of the city. One volunteer recalled, A stray police unit is fighting. These are Poznanians, 30 men. They fight as long as they have ammunition in their rucksacks, as long as grenades hang at their belts, as long as the machine gun they had pulled up the barricade spits bullets. The boy runners bring them more ammunition from the barracks and petrol bottles from the people. Women bring them jugs of hot coffee, bread, bigos, soup, and take away the wounded. The next day, the Soviets returned. They drove with their tanks on the bridge. Some of them were hit and caught fire. But eventually, due to their sheer numbers again, they were able to overwhelm the defenders. On the night of the 21st of September, the Polish authorities, they ordered a general evacuation. Soviet sources did claim 600 Poles died in the battle, but this number did not include those students and scouts that were captured and mass executed afterwards. Killings and maltreatment of Polish POWs happened, especially against Polish officers that were seen as class enemies. Many Polish soldiers that were not able to escape, they discarded their uniforms, trying not to be captured by the Red Army. Eventually, 22,000 Poles would be murdered by the Soviets on Stalin's orders during the Katyn massacre 1 year later. Some Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews, they welcomed the Soviets and they hailed them as liberators, welcoming them with bread and salt, a traditional Slavic welcome. And they erected makeshift triumphal arches bearing the hammer and sickle. Smaller battles took place during the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland, but I do want to discuss one more in which both the Soviets and the Germans were involved, and that was the siege of Lwów. The city was the country's southeastern cultural and political center and the centerpiece of Poland's defense in the region for control of the Romanian bridgehead. It was besieged by the Germans from September 12th. When the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland commenced, it resulted in a lot of confusion. Soviet agents and sympathizers in Lwów, they spread misinformation that the Soviets were here to help them against the Germans. The Soviets, they dropped leaflets on the city in which they claimed that the Polish government had left the country. Officially, they did this on the 17th of September. The Polish leadership, including President Ignacy Mościcki and the other high-ranking officials, crossed the border into Romania late that day, seeking refuge. The Soviet leaflets urged the Poles to lay down their weapons, but the Germans had also dropped leaflets on the city in which was written that the Soviets had entered Poland as Germany's allies. The note falsely claimed that Warsaw had capitulated and Lwów should do the same, and if not, the city would be subjected to ruthless air and land assaults. Polish High Command instructed the defenders of Lwów how to respond to the Soviet incursion. We are not at war with the Bolsheviks. On the frontier, the KOP has fired warning shots to show that we are not allowing them in willingly. Do not engage them unless you are engaged. Polish General Langner observed how the Soviets east of the city generally refrained from engaging Polish forces. He did not believe their friendly intentions though, and he was about to order an evacuation of the city, but when two armored trains arrived, he decided to continue the defense of Lwów. On the 19th of September, the Germans demanded surrender, but the Poles refused. The Germans, they launched another assault on the city, and this was repelled with heavy losses. But the Germans soon prepared to leave the city because the city was in the Soviet sphere of influence that was agreed upon in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I read around 1,000 German Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, they died during the siege of the city. The Soviets then approached from the east. A Polish delegation led by Colonel Bronisław Rakowski met with the Soviet vanguard. He asked them why they were here, and the following conversation occurred. "Why have you come?" To which the Red Army colonel replied, "You must have read the papers." Bronisław said no papers had come through. To which the colonel replied, "So maybe you've heard on the radio what has taken place." Bronisław could not muster the courage to tell the truth, that the Soviets were here as allies of Hitler. Instead, he told that the Germans had cut the power and therefore all communications were down. He repeated his question. The Red Army colonel falsely claimed that the Red Army was here to take on the Germans and demanded entry to the city. But Bronisław said he had not the authority to let them in. Therefore, the colonel asked for several observation points, but the Polish officer was not fooled. That morning, near Wyniki, east of Lwów, German and Soviet forces briefly clashed. Most likely this was a mistake, friendly fire so to say, and both sides suffered material and personnel losses. Polish commander Langner had a meeting with his fellow commanders, and he had to face the reality. There were two enemy forces outside the gates of his city. There was no relief from outside, and there was none expected to come. Ammunition and food reserves were low, water and electrical supplies had already failed. Desertion of Belarusian and Ukrainian soldiers within Polish ranks was rampant. On the 22nd of September, the city surrendered, and the Red Army marched in. One eyewitness observed. When loudly rattling Tashankas, machine gun wagons, and tanks rode by, men clasped their guns tightly and looked suspiciously at the crowd. The despondent and dense multitude slowly trickled home. At the corner there stood a weeping janitor. They had killed his 12-year-old son for having smiled at the sight of the wretched Tashankas and the grimy soldiers. Vilno, or Vilnius, and its surrounding areas were transferred to Lithuania according to the Soviet-Lithuanian Mutual Assistance Treaty. In exchange, Lithuania agreed to allow Soviet military bases in strategic parts of the country. This was the beginning of the end of Lithuania's independence. In June 1940, Lithuania was officially annexed to the USSR. So how many soldiers fell during the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland? Molotov admitted to the Supreme Soviet on the 31st of October that the liberation of Eastern Poland had cost the Red Army 737 killed and 1,862 wounded. Polish specialists claim up to 3,000 killed and 8,000 to 10,000 wounded, as well as the destruction of 100 Soviet tanks and armored cars. Polish military deaths are variously estimated at between 3,000 and 7,000, with 20,000 wounded. An additional 1,000 to 2,500 were executed or murdered in immediate reprisals by both Soviet and harassing Ukrainian nationalist forces. We can conclude that the Soviet invasion of Eastern Poland in 1939 was poorly planned and executed. The only reason it did not get bogged down was due to the fact that the Polish forces were decimated by the invading Germans. Who knows how the campaign would have unfolded if it were only the Soviets who attacked Poland. But given the Soviet hesitance to attack, it shows Red Army High Command wanted to be absolutely certain their attack was going to be a success. And because of this Soviet victory, Red Army High Command did not learn its lessons, and it would cost them dearly during their disastrous campaign against Finland near the end of that year, the so-called Winter War. The Soviets now occupied territories that previously belonged to Poland and before that to Russia. As an occupation force, they behaved fairly well, unlike 1944-45 when they came around a second time. Historian Catherine Meredale wrote about the 1939-41 Soviet occupation the following. To prevent breaches of the law, the Red Army had issued the soldiers involved in the occupation with a small allowance in cash, but there was just too much to spend it on. If the locals would not sell their goods for kopecks, Russian money, the troops used threats to get the things they saw. They plundered simple cottages in search of loot. Nonetheless, regular Red Army men were relatively benign as an occupation force. So although Red Army soldiers behave generally correct, agitators that followed in their wake certainly did not. Soviet agitators urged peasants to take revenge on landlords. Though most people resisted the call to criminality, chaos reigned as thousands did not. Mass murders with axes were suddenly frequent. In some cases, the Red Army joined the fray, but more often they did not. The Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD, brought in notorious thugs that arrested and tortured many people. A total of 190,400 were arrested, of which 8,513 were executed. Many people were deported to Siberia and Kazakhstan and would not survive. Thanks again for Private Internet Access VPN for sponsoring this video. If you want to learn about the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland, I made a standalone episode of that. Click right here and click here for my video about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Thanks for watching. See you later.